you can do the honors, Adam, when you're ready.
Everybody ready? Okay, here we go.
There might be a bit of lag for a moment, but it'll go away, I think. So just click it once, and then...
There we go. Is everybody seeing that?
Okay, so if you head over to the cliff here, you'll see some huge new object in the world. Okay, so I'll briefly explain what it is. Feel free to go and run on it. That's the point. So I'll explain what this data is. So the far right corner, so where that huge peak is, that corner represents 0 solar capacity and 0 wind capacity. And moving closer to us along the long axis increases the solar generating capacity in California. So modeling using California's conditions. And moving left to right, moving to the left increases the wind generating capacity. So each column you see here, its height is in units of billions of dollars. And if you turn around and look behind you near the peak, there's a blue column. That height represents $10 billion worth of capital investment in generating capacity. So the heights of these columns represent the cost of building out a system that has the corresponding amount of solar and wind generating capacity. And
so this is in effect a 3D rendering of that heat map, of a heat map that I showed you. And so yes, that's exactly right. Danny, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, maybe I'll comment that this mountain, a few of you are scaling. I'm calling it Mount McKinsey because this represents a conventional analyst's view of how you should build an energy system for the future. So these black parts, these represent just building enough wind and solar to exactly reproduce the current level of supply, or rather to meet the existing demand. So that's maybe what many people think you should do. And when you see prices quoted, Adam can correct me, but when you see people quoting how much it would cost, that's the number they're quoting, that height there, which of course makes absolutely no sense, as Adam is pointing out, because what you should do is build the lowest cost system, which is down here where I'm standing, this single white column, which is the bottom of this data.
That's exactly right. And shall we, Dan, do you want to start the challenge? What do you think?
They've gotten pretty high already.
Wait, the challenge isn't to get to the top?
The challenge is to get to the top, but you'll fail without a bit of help. And
I see a number of people floating. How is that possible?
They're not floating. You're just not close enough to see the.
I see it. It's outside the rendering range. Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Got it.
Yeah. Well, but now I'm going to have to call you all back. So everybody back down to the white pixel, please, so that we can start the challenge. Otherwise, it's unfair. You're all preempting the challenge.
I want to go it my way.
Yeah, you can try afterwards to get up there that way. But...
I worked out that you can use the heads of the other climbers in order to help you get.
Could use teamwork.
Yeah. Oh yeah, teamwork. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Okay, so as usual, Adam will stick around and you can ask him questions. But since we're all here, we might as well start the challenges. So I'll say something as I'm running back about the second challenge. So the first challenge is to get to the peak of Mount McKinsey any way you can.
Okay, ready?
Challenge 3. No, not yet.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So stick around the white pixel, everybody. The other challenge is related to the logistic differential equation, and maybe I'll say something about that once everybody's back from attempting to climb Mount McKinsey. Okay, so take it away.
Before we start, can we do a quick round of applause for the talk?
Oh yes.
Thanks, Adam.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. And what an amazing environment and experience this is. I feel like you feel like I'm seeing the future of education. It's like holding the first iPhone. It didn't work perfectly, but you knew you were holding the future in your hands, and this really does feel like that. It's super exciting. I love it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start the challenge. Dan, is that okay?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, here we go.
Everyone, go. Okay, I'm gonna take my camera and see if I can capture the madness. Okay. Oh, yeah, there you go.
There we are. Somebody's on their way up.
Whoa! Whoa! What is that?
Oh, some of you are pretty far up already.
What?
One of those accelerator pads. Those are gravity
Yeah.
disruptions.
I drop off the wall.
Yeah, you got to be careful. You'll get enough vertical velocity to go right over the top, and then you won't be able to see it anymore.
Oh, no.
And if you come down and hit it at a bad angle, you'll do the flips.
Oh, the rag.
Ah, there we go. What was that?
Whoa! Whoa!
Whoa! Oh my god. Oh my god.
Oh, no.
I think I might have got it. All I can see now is the moon.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm coming back down.
yeah, it was you, Matt. You won.
Oh,
You probably will die as a consequence. But
Nah, I'm landing on the top this time.
That's crazy.
Adam, I have some questions.
Second from.
Oh,
sure.
someone just clipped past me, and I only saw them for a frame. Oh yeah, no, I'm gone. Wow, cool. Adam, I have some questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
So thanks for the talk. So I want to zoom in to the current time. I might I've been living at home or renting for most of my life, but I might own a roof soon. Should I buy solar panels or should I wait until 2030?
So this is a great question, and it's a permanent conundrum whenever you have a deflationary regime for anything, right? Should you wait for the next version that's cheaper, or should you go ahead and dive in and adopt the technology now? And that's it's a bit of a paradoxical situation, and it's tough because just in a very, I'll answer your actual concrete question in just a second, but in the abstract, this is a really important challenge that society faces, right? I mean, in many ways we depend on early adopters who make economically irrational and suboptimal choices to provide the initial demand that allows the growth and the scaling of the industry to then really open the door to widespread adoption down the road. And so this is a long-standing argument for the need to have governments play a role in kickstarting things through whatever, certainly funding research and development, but also through direct subsidies to lower the economic barriers initially. So to answer your specific question, what you can do now, and there are many providers who have online tools, is you can go and look at who's available in your area to do solar roof installs and do a break-even calculation and say, okay, well, given the cost of electricity, the prices of electricity, what I'm paying today, how long would it take for an investment in a solar rooftop and or an investment in a household battery like a Tesla Powerwall battery inside? How long would it take to break even on that investment, and then subsequent to that, actually have it pay off, actually have it save you money? And there are a number of calculators that are providing that now. And it used to be 15 or 20 years, not too many years ago. I mean, 5 years ago, you would be lucky to break even on a solar investment in 20 years, even in an area where the price of electricity is quite high. But now, these are really starting to become quite attractive. Now, I don't know the answer specifically in the area where you guys are, but in most of the United States that has reasonably good sun, certainly California, certainly areas like Texas, the break-even period is below 5 years now. So if you think you're going to be in a place for 5 years or more, it's now at the point where it starts to make good sense to think about investing in a solar roof, especially if you, for example, are coming around to the time where you would need to replace your roof anyway. Integrating solar into that process can make sense. Then a second thing to think about there, or at least I guess to look into. I don't know the Australian market as well as I should, but in the United States, there are many finance providers now. So even just a few years ago, if you wanted to build a solar roof, you were gonna have to, put it on a credit card or dig the cash out of your savings, or maybe take out a loan from your bank if you could convince them to give you a loan to finance this, even if you knew you were going to break even relatively quickly, within 10 years or something like that. But now there are many financial services, including at many just consumer banks, that will underwrite a solar roof loan for you. So in other words, you don't have to have cash up front for this. You can finance it the way you would finance buying and purchasing a car. And there are, of course, also in a number of places, again, I don't know Australia as well as I should, a number of places where there are government programs, both local and national, that are set up specifically to assist with this process. Everything from, sort of scoping and designing the system to finding financing services, to even giving you rebates or subsidies or helping you sort out your feed-in tariff contracts if you're in an area where you're allowed to sell your excess power back to the power company, to the utility, the grid. Those are all things that you can look into. So, you probably know all of this already. The simple answer is, we're starting to get to the point now where it's a pretty darn good idea if you're going to own your home for 5 years or more. I would say definitely look into it.
Thanks. I'm probably going to do it anyway, regardless of all of those calculations, but that's helpful too. My mum's a solar installer, and she's going to help out with all of that. And I think
so
in Australia, I think we do have, I think we do have some rebates still, although they're not as generous as they initially were. Cool. If anyone else has questions, they can ask a question, but I have a couple more questions for after that.
I think I'd love to ask.
Maybe we can do this in
Yeah.
parallel. So obviously the point of this is to hear Adam's thoughts, so we can continue to ask questions and hear them in this channel. But I'll officially start challenge 3A and just briefly explain what it is. So if you're interested in that, come back over to the blackboards for a moment. So you can see on the second board where I've outlined the solutions, or sort of two classes of solutions, and I circled 4 regions. The challenge is the following. So I would like you to answer the following question for each of those 4 regions. So the question is this exponential growth or decay? That's the first question. So obviously region 1 is yes, that's exponential growth. But what about region 2? Is that exponential decay to the carrying capacity? Region 4, is that exponential decay to the carrying capacity? And is region 3 exponential decay? So that's the first part. You need to answer that for all 4 regions. And you need to give some kind of justification for your answer in each case. Again, maybe just skipping exponential growth for region 1, because that's something that's quite standard. So I want to see for each region, I answer yes or no to is it exponential decay or growth, and then a justification. It doesn't have to be a proof, but something that would convince a physicist, let's say, with no pejorative meant there. Okay, so that's challenge 3A. There's 2 sets of boards down at the bottom of this peak. Sort of if you just walk off the edge of this red timber area, you'll see 2 sets of boards. So maybe just pick one and we'll have 2 teams and we'll see who gets to the solution first. And feel free to discuss in the dedicated channels that are down there, or stay in this channel and keep asking questions to Adam. Are there any questions about the challenge?
Do we essentially just need the logistic DE that you've highlighted?
Yeah, you can reason directly from this logistic DE. That's right.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so good luck,
Dan,
everyone.
Dan, I have a question for you, but I don't want it to interfere with the challenge. Is there any way I can talk to you without? Maybe just send you a text. Sure. Well, I'm very curious though.
Well, why don't we? There's a channel just here. If you can see just next to me, there's a solar mezzanine channel. So let's just jump in this.
Z
I think
solar
it didn't put you in the channel. Sorry, Adam. So you might have to do it manually in Discord. I don't know why. Yep. What's the question?
Dan, can
Yep. Yeah, I can hear you.
hear me? Okay. Hey, so my question is, it's on board 2. So the decay curve when you're above the carrying capacity, is that right now? That, I mean, just looking at it, it doesn't look sigmoidal. But I'm wondering if it would be a sigmoid if you were more than 50% above the carrying capacity.
No, it'll never have an
It'll never happen. And is that just because of the? Well, I don't have the, not seeing.
The way you prove that. Yeah, so if you take the second derivative of the population as a function of time, so an inflection point is where the slope reaches a maximum. So where the slope reaches a maximum, the second derivative will be 0.
Right.
And so you just take the second derivative of p using the differential equation, and then you look at it, and you can see that it can only possibly have a 0 if p is less than c. So if p is greater than c, the second derivative just is never 0, so there can't be an inflection point. So it'll always be this kind of decreasing sloped thing. The exact nature of the curve when p is small or p is large, much greater than c is less obvious. That's, I guess, the one tricky point in this challenge. But it's definitely, there's no inflection point.
Interesting. Okay. Thanks. That's cool.
I was wondering if there is like results in ecology or something for coupled logistic growth that might explain the 75% inflection point. Like I'm struggling to model that. So essentially, you have two modeling what you mentioned earlier in the presentation of two technology competing against each other, so that the carrying capacity. So the depth chance is equal to the carrying capacity minus P1 minus P2. Wonder whether that shifts the two equations. But I don't think that would shift the inflection point of either, and I struggle to think how one technology sort of takes off in that environment.
Yeah, that's Dan. Please step in here and help me, because the maths are certainly beyond me. The basic problem with that, the bottom line is that we don't know. We don't understand the underlying nature. We don't have a good explanation for the exact characteristic of the sigmoid curve, exactly why it's S-shaped. We have, you can produce, and Dan and I were talking about this, you can produce an S-shaped curve with a variety of different patterns of growth. You can, and logistic functions are one way that a sigmoid curve can emerge, but there are a number of others. And we honestly don't know which one, if any single one is operative for technology disruptions, and we don't have a good theory, a good explanation for exactly the underlying mechanism for the sigmoid function. The simplest, and maybe this is really not going beyond a qualitative or even just common sense level. Simple.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt. I think if this is something, I mean, we don't mind this being more publicly sort of heard, right? So maybe we can move back to the other channel, because I think there's no reason to be private. Yep, go ahead. Since we're jumping in mid-conversation, Adam was just answering a question about modeling technology disruption using these kinds of ideas. But now I can't hear him.
I can't hear him.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Adam. I don't know what happened.
Am I not in the right
Oh, we can just hear you now.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, unfortunately, we are limited to an essentially qualitative model of disruption for now. We do not have a good enough understanding of exactly how an S-shaped curve emerges beyond just what is essentially a common sense qualitative observation that the adoption rate of technology starts out slowly. It increases to some peak rate, and that would be the steepest part of the sigmoid curve, the inflection point in the sigmoid curve. And then after that, the rate of adoption of the technology slows down and ultimately reaches zero, and it reaches saturation where everybody has adopted the technology and there's nobody left to convert or to switch over. And as you might imagine, a low, high, low pattern in the rate, basically, I think, Dan, you call it just a bump. That could take a variety of different forms. It might be sort of a Gaussian bell-shaped curve, starting low, reaching a peak, and then dropping off again. But it could be quite a different pattern, and it could be just a simple, like a simple arch, right? It could be linear, which is just a steady increase up to a peak and then a steady increase down. All of those would give you a sigmoid curve of some sort. So there's more than one way to make a sigmoid, and we honestly don't know which of those or what is the best explanation for technology disruption, or if there even is a single explanation that would apply generally across all cases. It could be that different technologies show a sigmoid, but the underlying function is quite different. Maybe some are pretty close to logistic. Maybe some are not like that at all, and very different. And it could be that information technologies show one pattern, physical transportation technologies show another, and so forth. We honestly, this is an area that is poorly understood, and that needs more work. So I don't have a good explanation, and it's a question I would love to have the answer to.
Right. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for the very comprehensive answer. Yeah. I do agree that the S shape, it's S shape possibly due to like just a few mathematical property that has some physical justification, just like the left and right limits and a inflection point somewhere. That's enough to guarantee an S-shaped curve, I think, at least usually qualitatively. But I was just trying to understand whether or not like there is like just toy. I'm more interested in this on a mathematical modeling side. I'm not familiar with modeling, like economical modeling.
I just stepped back in, so maybe Adam said this already, but it seems that actually this hasn't been that well studied from the point of view of quantitative sort of modeling, of actually giving a justification from first principles for why. I mean, it's probably, as Adam was showing, their data, I mean, the data's extensive in the sense it covers many different technology disruptions, but in some sense it's difficult to really pin down exactly what you're measuring, and maybe some of the data is quite old. So the data's, robust in many ways, and from that data, Adam can speak more to it, but it seems that the inflection point does not happen at half the final sort of value or asymptote. So probably it isn't actually governed by a logistic DE.
Yeah.
But what exact, could you give a very simple kind of derivation of a DE which gives rise to qualitatively correct behavior for the disruption? That seems to be an open question, maybe, Adam.
Yeah, I have two sort of proposition, I guess. One is the thing that I mentioned just now, is that this is maybe just a two-player game where both players are in the same environment with a constant carrying capacity, and that interaction might explain that. The other one is maybe the other thing that was mentioned early in the in the presentation is that the market cap, so the carrying capacity itself, might be expanding because the new technology has more users. Yeah, I don't know. It might be interesting to just run a.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, right? As the sort of market penetration increases, the carrying capacity also maybe increases. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
that's one of the things that's being discovered along the way.
Yeah, this is sort of where my suspicions lie. That the reason the inflection point on the final curve, when you look backward, you look retrospectively at the history, once the disruption is complete, the reason why the inflection point tends to occur around, well, it's anywhere from sort of 60 to 80, or maybe even 85%. There's the variance is quite large, but around 75% is a reasonable approximation. It seems to intuitively make sense that if the market itself were expanding during the process of the disruption, that it could essentially drag that inflection point higher as you were going along, and that retrospectively from the asymptote, when you finally have reached the carrying capacity, that's what it would look like in hindsight. But exactly how, exactly how that might be captured mathematically in a predictive sense would certainly depend on being able to accurately predict the final limit. The final. In this example, we're calling carrying capacity, but for example, in a real world case, it would be something like a market. Like how many digital cameras are really ultimately going to be able to sell to people, or sell every year, depending on how you want to measure it. And same for cars or electricity generating capacity or anything else. And that's difficult. That is its own separate challenge, is to try in some way to anticipate what the new scale of the system will become after it has been disrupted. And we've seen very poor success in predicting that variable, as that parameter of things as well. And so any progress on any of these fronts would be very valuable.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that.
I mean, I can give you an example. Analysts today disagree by more than one order of magnitude in how many electric vehicles we are ultimately going to have. Right. And so it's part of the exploit. So it's perhaps simple as you might be thinking. It tends not to be that people expect we are going to have, it's going to take us a long time to replace every gasoline and diesel vehicle with an electric vehicle. It's actually that we shift at the same time to transportation as a service. We find that we can travel more vehicle miles, but that traveling is being done with fewer vehicles. For example, the difference in mileage in a taxi, that could be 100,000 kilometers or more per year for a taxi, because it drives all day long and even during the night, right? But for a private vehicle, people drive much less. And if everybody in the future is riding in essentially robotic, robo taxis, autonomous taxis, then you can drive the same or indeed more miles, more passenger miles, more cargo miles, more general vehicle miles, but you can do so with a smaller number of actual vehicles. So the market, as measured by the thing with real utility, travel itself, can grow, but less actual vehicles. And so there's a lot of room to disagree on. Okay, well, if we're talking about electric vehicle disruption, how do we predict that final size of the electric vehicle market, which is different than trying to predict travel behavior for people in the end. So this is a really, really sticky, challenging issue for any technology disruption at all.
Do you get any pushback, Adam, on the kind of like inherent determinism of these kinds of predictions? I mean, I guess the people involved in them feel like they have lots of agency, right? Like the CEOs of solar companies or anybody else involved in actually pushing the products that are responsible for each dot point on these curves. I mean, maybe that's an entire lifetime worth of commitment to a given technology. It must feel a little deflating to see a logarithmic plot like this. Does this sense of loss of agency maybe explain some of the disbelief you encounter when you sort of talk about these topics?
Well, it's funny, it goes both ways. There's certainly some of that, certainly. And then the flip side of that coin is that, and we hear this with Moore's law, right, is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. By setting these targets and identifying the consistency of the pattern, you have the agents in the system who do have agency, perhaps not deliberately, perhaps on some not quite deliberate, not quite conscious level, organizing their activity to align with that projection, with that pattern going forward. So we sort of see both of those things: the idea that there's a lack of agency and that there is a deterministic quality, a technological determinism. Certainly, an enormous amount of critique from of thinking about this technological advancement as something that's predetermined or inevitable. And then the idea that, well, we're making these prophecies come true through the agency that people actually have. So there's a strange paradoxical combination of both over attribution and under attribution of agency. And I don't have a strong opinion. I think it probably varies an enormous amount from one disruption to the next, one industry to the next. And maybe one other thing to think about. Another thing to think about through this is that if I'm trying to think of what the best way to explain it is, if good way to put it. I'm trying to think of an example to illustrate the idea with. I guess the simplest explanation, the simplest way to express what I'm talking about is to say, is to ask a question. Are we really looking at technological advancement, or are we looking at a feature of another system? Say, for example, capitalism. Is all this innovation and progress and improvement in technical knowledge and improvement in all these things we might want to measure, like what an image costs to produce, or what a mile to travel, what that costs, however you want to measure cost, financially and otherwise. Are these really are they really a function of technical?
Hello?
Yo.
Okay. So region 1, yes. Region 2, the argument is...
So I just kind of it's by symmetry, I guess. So I just defined the upside down version of the population, which is how far away you are from the carrying capacity. And I found out that it has the same differential equation.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to see, you want to say some kind of approximation, right? So in region 2, you want to say something like...
so for L sufficiently small,
constant.
For L sufficiently small, then this ends up being proportional to L. DLDT ends up being proportional to L.
Yeah, correct. So for region 2, you need a slightly different argument. What's that?
For P,
so I'll give you a tick for region 1.
Okay, I've defined L as C minus P. So I guess if I just translate back that argument, for P sufficiently close to C, then L is sufficiently small, and I guess I showed that it has the equation.
Sorry, yeah, that's right. Okay, so I'm happy with that.
This DLDT that may have to actually be dPdt here. I can't remember, but they're just the negative of each other.
Okay, so I'm happy with that. let's do R3 and R4 separately. So you say they're both not exponential, and your argument for R4 is what?
For R3 and R4, my argument, I thought you could do them in the same way. Maybe I've made a mistake. But I looked at the excess beyond C. So I defined that excess as P minus C, and then I tried to figure out that differential equation. And it came out with a quadratic term and a linear term. And so I think because of the quadratic term, it's not exponential.
Yep. Okay, that's correct for 3, but I would disagree about 4.
Okay.
So maybe have a think about that.
All right, I'll have another think. Thanks.
Yeah. Who's down here? Is this you, Will? There's nobody down here.
In a meaningful way. That would be an enormous challenge. And so we're stuck retrospectively analyzing what are at best quasi-experiments, where maybe there's a situation where a variable is changing in a pretty clear way, and we can make reasonable assumptions about other variables in the system, and we don't need to model those. It can explain all of their variation. Maybe we can get away with, and as a quasi-experiment, assuming all else equal and just focusing on one or perhaps a small handful of variables. But this is the challenge with scientific research that's not bench science, it's not laboratory science. You cannot a nuclear energy technology that could compete in terms of cost, for example, with solar and wind and batteries. And we've been waiting for something like that to occur. I mean, we could have a breakthrough in nuclear fission technology, some form of fission that would be more controllable, that could be more modular. In other words, done at a smaller scale, that could be that would be safer and produce less waste, all in a manner that is affordable. That would just be incredible. Unfortunately, we don't have any strong candidates for fission technologies that meet all of those criteria. Many of the things seem possible, but making them cheap is almost always the real stumbling block. That's fission. Fusion, harder to see how that ever becomes, not ever, but how that in a competitive time frame, how fusion emerges.
All right. So what's the story?
Okay, so I had the quadratic version, and I've double checked that. I've still got that, but that one of those terms in the quadratic are the difference. It's how far p is above c, and so when you take that to 0, then its square is going to vanish much faster than the linear component, and so that's how you get back the exponential growth.
Yep. Okay, I'll give that to you. So let's see. So okay, you win both.
Nice.
Nice. Basically, it looks like something like dp dt is minus p squared.
Yeah. But it's the same equation that governs also region 4. So would you say that that whatever the solution to this differential equation is, it is not exponential noticeably around in region 3, but when you go further out, it approximates exponential?
Yeah, I guess probably I'd say that, I mean, strictly speaking, it's not exponential anywhere, but in region 4, it's well approximated by an exponential function. So any solution to this dE, at least over a short range, will be well approximated by a solution to an approximating dE, which is of exponential form.
Cool.
But in region 3, I did some examples. You can see, very easily that if you try and take exponential growth and fit it to this dE very quickly, it will diverge, but a solution to this quadratic thing will stay with it for quite a long time. So it's really governed by this different kind of behavior, this minus p squared behavior.
Cool.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting, the collapse is of a very different nature than the exponential growth. It's much faster.
Where are you guys?
Blackboard's up at the top.
Conversing secretly.
Oh, you're back at the top. Sorry,
Yeah.
yeah, I was away from keyboard, and then I came back and went downstairs. So now I didn't come back.
Yeah, well, you've missed it. Matt won this one as well.
Ah, goddammit. Oh, good work, man.
Okay,
Thanks.
I'll
I
just
gotta
type this
head
in.
back to the main one to ask some more questions.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I'm interrupting, but so challenge 3A has also been completed. Matt won both 3A and 3B, so he'll be getting 2 sets of loot.
Can I ask another question?
Of course.
So, what is like the backup plan for when like if there was like no sun for a while, like it was just cloudy for let's say a week or so? Like, would you still have to have like a backup plan?
It's a very good question. What I suspect is going to happen is that it will make some sense to simply mothball a small number of existing power plants. And by mothball, I mean shut them down permanently, but keep them in place and capable of being restarted in emergency in some reasonable amount of time, like maybe over a 24 or 48 hour period, you could get the old power plant back up and running. In the case of a once in 10 years emergency or a once in 20 years emergency, if you have a really unusual disaster, a hurricane or some natural disaster like that, I think that most regions will probably choose to do that because they already have those power plants. The other thing you would do with a power plant is just decommission it and sell off the scrap. And you're going to see a lot of that, where the equipment will be dismantled and recycled or reused or resold to other industries and so forth. But I do think it will make sense for some reasons for some regions to just maintain an emergency backup reserve that can be brought online, not at a split second. You wouldn't have to have people there all day long, maintaining it and ready to run at a moment's notice. But something that could at least be turned on in an emergency, true emergency, once every few years. It's also possible, I think, fairly likely that Western countries, maybe all, I'm not sure. The geopolitics is complicated, but I think it's likely that countries that have nuclear power today are probably going to keep at least one nuclear reactor running in their country, not because of the power, but in order to have the technological capability for anything nuclear related. In other words, you need to have a critical mass, no pun intended, of expertise. You need to have nuclear physicists. If you want to have nuclear weapons programs, nuclear defense expertise, and one way that Western countries today that have nuclear power, that also have a nuclear defense program. So it's not all countries. Like there's overlap. There are anyway. I won't get into the geopolitical details, but I think it stands to reason that if you're a country and you want to maintain a nuclear arsenal or nuclear capability for military purposes, then you will keep at least one civilian nuclear facility running. And one nuclear power plant would not be able to provide backup to a huge country, but for a country the size of an American state. So, for example, in a country the size of France or something like that, which gets a lot of its energy from nuclear power today, it might consider keeping one or two of its nuclear power plants running indefinitely, for defense purposes, basically. And I see some scenarios for existing power plants to stay operational or nearly operational as emergency contingencies. But the real way that you deal with an extreme weather event is you overbuild the solar and wind and battery system. And I think that's what we're going to see is overbuilding with more solar, more wind, and more batteries. One thing to keep in mind is that even on the cloudiest days, there's still sunshine coming through, and it's not dark unless it's actually dark. So cloudy days significantly reduce electricity. They do, certainly, but they don't reduce it to zero. And so a country could limp along for a few days if it absolutely had to, just with solar on cloudy days. You'd also build bigger batteries. Then there are other things that I didn't mention, like the interaction between electric vehicles and electric power systems. Once you have tens of millions of vehicles and they've all got a big electric battery in them, then that can function as an emergency backup system for your electric power. And we're already seeing this. So, for example, in Texas today, over the last week, there's been one of the worst winter storms in Texas history, recorded history. And there have been a lot of power outages because the storm created a record high electricity demand. Everybody wanted their heating on, turning their electric heating on, building commercial buildings and residences both. And the unusually cold weather knocked out one of the big nuclear power stations. Ironic, but nuclear power stations in Texas were not built to withstand kind of winter. Nuclear power stations in other countries have been, but in Texas, no, and it's a very old power station. So when part of their cooling system, I believe it was, their intake water, the water that comes in to cool the facility, part of that pipeline started to freeze because they just never expected it would freeze. And then, of course, what did they have to do? They had to shut down the nuclear reactor. And a big chunk of the power for that
because
region
it's not
of Texas,
like a nuclear station produces much heat. You can't melt some ice.
So, I mean, it's ironic, right? Here's another irony for you. Heat waves, hot weather, also causes nuclear reactors to shut down for two reasons. And this happens in France quite a bit. When they have a heat wave in the summer, their nuclear power plants come offline. And there's two reasons. One is that you have to have a large temperature differential between the input water and in order for it to do its cooling job, based on the specifications of the power plant. If the power plant was specified such that it was always assuming the water coming into the plant would be 15 degrees Celsius, and suddenly all of the water that's available is 25 degrees Celsius, you can't cool the plant sufficiently well, and you have to shut the plant down. So that happens. And then the other thing that is for ecological reasons, if you have very high temperature water coming in and the average temperature of the water, the discharge water from a nuclear power plant, this is not radioactive or anything, it's just hot water. That has to be mixed with colder water before you put it back in the river, or you will kill everything in the river. And because of ecological laws, maybe there are countries with nuclear power plants that ignore the ecological, implications, the consequences. But in France, as a specific example, will shut down nuclear power plants if the discharged water exceeds a certain temperature because it will damage the rivers, the ecology, the life in the rivers. And so these are vulnerabilities to weather that nuclear power plants have. It's maybe they're not well known, but they're certainly but from the public may not know about them. But obviously, electricity planners and utility operators and so on are very familiar with these. So nuclear power plants can be vulnerable to these things too, and that's what happened in Texas. Is it got really cold and we had power outages. Now, what we're seeing is it's interesting is that if you own a Tesla electric vehicle, and especially if you also own one of their household Powerwall batteries in your house, which quite a few people in Texas do, you don't care if the power went out because you're fine for several days. So there are a lot of these very smug, and today still, you have to be quite rich to buy a Tesla system. But you got a lot of these smug people saying, aha, you know, the power outage didn't affect me. I have a Tesla. And, you know, it's kind of frustrating to see that people gloating about that today. But we can imagine in 10 or 15 years, that could become quite standard, where you have, you know, a significant portion of all homes are in that situation. So we would be a much more resilient system to severe weather and other problems if we didn't have all of our eggs in just a few baskets, a few large power plants. But if we had a decentralized system with thousands and thousands and thousands of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries spread everywhere, that would make us much more resilient. Sure.
I had a kind of follow-up question. You mentioned the geopolitics. I mean, obviously oil and to some lesser extent coal have large geopolitical implications. I mean, already some of the materials involved in solar panels are subject to some considerations, but I'm sort of thinking more specifically about once everybody actually gets the idea of superpower, and in a decade or two, you know, the industries of the future, whether it's cryptocurrency or huge data centers full of AI training runs that rely on this, I mean, do you think that it's possible that some of these trends are interrupted by geopolitical concerns? I mean, whether it's, you know, China refusing to export rare earth metals or anything like that. I mean, right now, maybe it's not sort of on people's radar because we haven't actually become reliant on superpower, but you could imagine that changing rather quickly.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. My team is actually beginning the process of doing exactly this sort of research into geopolitics, which we're hoping to put out first round of that research later this year. So this is an extremely important area of concern. So there are a lot of second order effects of disruption. You know, you sort of have the immediate impacts of disruption, but then you have the knock-on effects. And there are major geopolitical implications for both the first order and the second order consequences of disruption. And for all three of these sectors, so energy is one great example, but certainly for food and for transportation as well. And a lot of that involves the supply chains behind those industries, which are enormous. And obviously they have major impact. I mean, they employ tens of millions of people, and they structure international trade today, the flow of commodities, you know, raw materials, metals. These are enormously consequential changes. So to your specific question, Dan, yes, I think that we are very likely to see a new geopolitical regime emerge around the raw material flows that are necessary to certainly during the initial build-out period of the system. One thing that's different about a 100% solar, wind, and battery system than today's system is that it's a stock-based, not a flow-based system. So once you have the stock of the generating capacity, and to a certain extent the battery capacity, the flow will be just maintenance. Whereas with fossil fuels, you have an enormous ongoing flow of oil, and that flow is permanent and growing. It was growing and growing and growing, of course, throughout the 20th century, and that was quite extraordinary. And I think we're going to see a different dynamic, but with a stock-based as opposed to a flow-based energy system. But there will be a lot of extraordinary consequences along the way. I give you a quick preview. This stuff is not confidential, but we're going to be doing research on it going later this year. But here's a couple fun things to think about. What is the there are three things that constitute the bulk of global shipping: cars, coal, and steel. Not too far behind those are grain. Animal feed is a major, by volume, import commodity that's traded. And a very large portion of all cargo miles traveled are those things. All of those things are going to be profoundly impacted by the combination of these three, food, transportation, energy, those three disruptions. They're really gonna smash that. We're not going to use any coal 10 years from now. We're going to need far less steel for a variety of reasons, but especially if we're building fewer cars, because most of them are operating 5 to 10 times as much as robotaxis as the average vehicle operates today. And we're not going to be shipping nearly as much grain around because we're going to be producing food more efficiently and also more locally. So it's because we're not going to be shipping, livestock or frozen seafood around the world. We won't have to. We will be producing it locally, whether it's the plant-based alternatives that are very sophisticated, or whether it's fish fillets grown in a laboratory. There are going to be lots of exciting geopolitical consequences of upending the trade structure we have around the world today. So yeah, it's a great question. And with that, you guys, I do have to get going, but thank you so much for having me. This is really fun, really exciting, and I honestly do feel like I'm seeing the future of education here. This is super, super cool. So
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure coming. And Dan, congratulations. This is extremely successful. I think it's moved out of the experiment category, and you're now at the vanguard of a new kind of practice and pedagogy. So it's amazing.
I should in that vein credit James with all the hard work he did on these whiteboards. They're really without these it would be much less useful. And Billy's done a lot of work on recently on the administration features, which I guess were made use of briefly in this talk to lock down and unlock the boards. So before we all go, so next week will be another builder event. I think there will be at least one interesting new node to unveil for people to go and have a look at. And the week after that will be Zilingye talking about, Zhuangzi. So it's the sort of original Chinese philosophy text, but sort of given a bit of a twist. So look forward to that, and I'll see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks heaps.
See ya.